For a decade, my life was built on a lie, a cruel, carefully constructed story that cast me as the villain in my own family's tragedy. My name is Jennifer, and from the time I was 16, my stepmother, Linda, told anyone who would listen that I was the reason my mother was dead. She said my difficult teenage years, my moodiness, my rebellion, all the normal messy parts of growing up had put my mother in an early grave. It was a poison she dripped into the ear of my father, Mike, day after day, until he looked at me and saw not his daughter, but a constant, painful reminder of his loss. A loss I had supposedly caused. Linda, of course, was the saint. The woman who had stepped in to salvage our broken family, to raise me and her own perfect daughter, Kayla, with a grace my mother had apparently lacked. Kayla was the sun, I was the shadow. She got praise, I got sighs of disappointment. She got new cars and college tuition paid without a second thought. I got lectures on responsibility and reminders of the financial burden I'd always been. This was the family narrative, cemented in the stone of repetition and unchallenged for 10 long years. I had started to believe it myself. You hear something enough times, especially from the people who are supposed to love you, and it seeps into your bones. The guilt becomes a part of your own DNA, but a legacy of lies has a funny way of unraveling. Sometimes all it takes is a single thread. For me, that thread arrived in a plain cardboard box, left on my doorstep on a Tuesday. There was no return address, just my name, written in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, were 5 leather-bound journals, and with them, a note. It was from my mother's best friend, a woman I hadn't seen since the funeral. She wrote that my mother had made her promise to keep these secret until I was strong enough to handle the truth. She believed that time was now. As I lifted the first journal, the worn leather cool against my shaking hands, I had no idea that I was holding a weapon. I thought I was just holding the last pieces of my mother. I was wrong. I was holding the truth, and in my family the truth was a bomb. The family narrative was about to be corrected, and the explosion would burn everything to the ground. The air in my small apartment felt thin, stolen. For a full hour I just stared at the box. It sat on my coffee table like an unexploded ordnance, a relic from a past I had been trained to regret. Part of me, the part that had been conditioned by Linda for a decade, wanted to throw it away, to burn it. It felt like trespassing, like violating the memory of the sainted mother Linda had created for me, a fragile woman broken by her ungrateful child. But a deeper, more stubborn part of me, a part that still remembered the warmth of my mother's real smile, not the pained one from Linda's stories, refused. My hands trembled as I finally untied the twine on the first journal. The pages were filled with my mother's elegant looping cursive, a script I hadn't seen since the last birthday card she'd ever given me. I opened to the first page and began to read. It wasn't a diary of a woman disappointed by her daughter. It was the logbook of a secret war. My mother, Sarah, had been fighting a losing battle against a degenerative genetic illness, something called Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, a neurological disorder that had been slowly, painfully eroding her body. She wrote about the weakness in her hands that made it hard to button her own blouses, the chronic pain in her legs she dismissed to us as just being tired. She hid it. She hid it from my father, from me, from everyone. She wrote, "I don't want them to see me as the illness. I don't want Jennifer to spend her teenage years being a nurse. I want her to be a kid. A messy, loud, difficult kid. I want her to have a normal life, even if I can't." Tears streamed down my face, hot and blurring the ink on the page. Every memory from that time replayed in my mind, but now through a new lens. The time I'd been furious with her for being too tired to come to my school play. She had spent that day at a neurologist's office, getting a painful nerve conduction study. The time I'd screamed at her that she didn't understand me when she wouldn't let me go to a concert on a school night. That night she had fallen trying to get out of the shower and had hidden the bruise on her hip for a week. I wasn't a burden to her. My difficult behavior, my teenage dramas, they were a comfort. They were proof that she had succeeded, that she had given me the gift of a normal life, a life where my biggest problem was a stupid curfew, not my mother's mortality. The guilt I had carried for a decade didn't just vanish. It curdled, transforming into a white-hot rage that settled deep in my gut. Linda hadn't just lied. She had taken my mother's greatest sacrifice and twisted it into a weapon to hurt me. She had desecrated her memory, turning her quiet strength into a weakness she could exploit for her own narrative. I flipped through the pages, my breath catching in my throat with every new entry, every detail of her private suffering. And then I found them, tucked into the back pocket of the third journal, a small, neat stack of letters, tied with a faded pink ribbon. The handwriting wasn't my mother's. It was sharp, angular, and sickeningly familiar. It was Linda's. They were love letters, addressed to my father, Mike, and they were dated. The first one was from nearly a year before my mother passed away, a year when she was at her sickest, when she was documenting how hard it was to even hold a pen, to climb the stairs to her own bedroom. While my mother was writing about her fear of dying, Linda was writing to my father about their stolen afternoons, about their future, about how he deserved a woman who was whole, a woman who could match his energy. One passage burned itself into my brain. My darling Mike, I know how hard it is. Seeing her fade like this, it's not fair to you. You deserve happiness, a real partner. I ache for the day we don't have to hide, the day we can build the life we talk about. Just be patient. It will all be over soon. It will all be over soon. The words hung in the silent room, a death sentence disguised as a promise. Linda wasn't just the other woman. She was a vulture, circling my mother's sickbed, waiting for her to die so she could take her place. And my father, he had let her. He had participated. His grief, the grief he had used to push me away, the grief that Linda had weaponized against me, wasn't for the wife he had lost. It was for the inconvenience of her dying. The whole narrative of our family, the story of the grieving husband and the difficult daughter, was a lie. It was a cover story for an affair, a sordid little romance that had flourished in the shadow of my mother's illness. For 10 years, I had walked on eggshells in my own home. I had apologized for things I hadn't done. I had accepted the role of the family scapegoat, the eternal fuck-up, the reason for every holiday argument, every financial strain, every dark mood that passed over my father's face. I had made myself small, quiet, and unobtrusive, hoping that one day, if I was good enough, if I was penitent enough, my father would finally forgive me for a crime I didn't commit. I remembered my 18th birthday. Linda had thrown a small, joyless party in the backyard. She'd made her signature paella, a dish she always made a big show of, claiming it was a complex recipe from a trip to Spain she and my father took, a trip I now realized they must have taken while my mother was still alive. In front of everyone, she'd given a toast. To Jennifer, she'd said, her voice dripping with false sincerity, "We know things have been challenging, but we hope that as you enter adulthood, you'll reflect on the past and understand the deep pain you caused. Your mother would have wanted you to be a better person." I had just stood there, burning with shame, my father nodding along beside her, his face a mask of solemn agreement. I remembered Christmases where Kayla would be showered with gifts, her achievements, a good grade on a paper, a spot on the debate team, celebrated with roaring enthusiasm. My own accomplishments, like my scholarship to a local college or my promotion at the library where I worked, were met with a thin, tight smile from Linda and a non-committal, "Oh, that's nice, dear," before she would immediately change the subject back to Kayla. My father, following her lead, would just grunt, his attention already drifting back to his phone or the television. It was a slow, methodical erasure of my personhood. Now, sitting on my floor, surrounded by the truth in my mother's own handwriting, something inside me broke. The part of me that had always craved their approval, that had yearned for a scrap of affection from my father, that had hoped Linda would one day see me as a daughter, simply died. It withered and turned to dust, and in its place, something cold and hard and clear began to grow. It wasn't about getting an apology anymore. It wasn't about being understood. It was about justice. It was about tearing down the monument of lies they had built on my mother's grave, and salting the earth so that nothing so toxic could ever grow there again. It wasn't about revenge, until it was. The dam of a decade of suppressed grief and anger didn't just break, it detonated. The quiet, apologetic Jennifer was gone. The person who stood up from that floor was someone else entirely. She was her mother's daughter, and she had a story to tell. The first call I made was to the number on the note that came with the journals. Carol, my mother's best friend. I hadn't spoken to her in a decade. Linda had skillfully painted her as a troublemaker. After the funeral, someone who didn't understand what the family was going through, and like a fool, I had believed her. Carol answered on the second ring, her voice hesitant, as if she'd been waiting for this call for years. I asked if we could meet. I didn't need to explain why. She knew. We met at a small, out-of-the-way coffee shop with worn velvet chairs and the comforting smell of roasted beans. Carol looked older, her face etched with lines of worry that hadn't been there before, but her eyes were the same, kind and piercingly intelligent. The moment she saw me, her own eyes filled with tears. "Jennifer," she whispered, pulling me into a hug that felt more real than any affection I'd received in the last 10 years. "I am so sorry. I should have done this sooner. Sarah," she made me promise. "She was so afraid of what the truth would do to you, to your relationship with your father. She wanted you to have a dad, even if he was flawed." The story tumbled out of me, a frantic, jumbled mess of the illness, the affair, the lies, the papaya, the constant, grinding weight of being the designated villain. Carol listened, her expression shifting from sorrow to a grim, steely anger that mirrored my own. She filled in the gaps. She told me how she'd watched Linda, a recently divorced friend of a friend my parents had, slowly ingratiate herself into their lives. How she'd always been there, a little too helpful, a little too sympathetic to my father's struggles with my mother's declining health. "I tried to warn your mother," Carol said, her voice thick with regret. "I told her Linda was a snake. But Sarah, bless her heart, she just saw a woman helping her husband. She was so focused on hiding her illness from you that she couldn't see the threat right in front of her." Carol confessed her own decade of guilt. "Every time I heard one of Linda's stories about you, passed through the grapevine of old friends, it was like a knife in my gut. I knew it was a lie. I let her poison your life because I was honoring a promise to a dead woman. It was a mistake. A promise to protect you shouldn't have involved letting you suffer." Her guilt wasn't a burden, it was a bond. It made her my ally, not out of pity, but out of a shared need to set the record straight for Sarah. As we talked, I pulled out the last journal. Tucked into an envelope in the very back was something else. Not a letter, but a folded-up legal document. It was a copy of a trust agreement. My mother, it turned out, had inherited a modest sum from her own parents. Worried about my father's increasingly poor financial decisions, something she'd noted he'd been making under Linda's advisement, she had secretly met with a lawyer and placed the entire inheritance, about $75,000, into a protected trust for me. The terms were explicit. The money was to be used for my college education, and as a down payment on my first home. It was to be managed by my father, as trustee, but it was legally, irrevocably mine. I had never seen a cent of it. When I'd asked about college funds, my father and Linda had sat me down for a serious talk about the financial strain my mother's illness had put on the family. They told me there was nothing left. They'd encouraged me to go to a local community college, to work part-time, to take out loans, all while my trust fund, my mother's final gift to me, was sitting there. And I had a sickening suspicion I knew where it had gone. Kayla's brand new convertible for her 16th birthday. Kayla's 4 years at an expensive private university out of state. The constant renovations on their house. The lavish anniversary trips. Carol looked at the document, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't just a lie, Jennifer. This is fraud. He had a fiduciary duty to you. He couldn't just absorb this money into the family budget, especially not to fund his mistress-turned-wife's lifestyle." The name of the lawyer who drafted the trust, a Mr. Alistair Finch, was printed at the bottom. A quick search on my phone showed he was still practicing, a seasoned estate lawyer in the next town over. This was it. This was the hidden leverage. The journals were the emotional bomb, the proof of the affair, and the lie about my mother's death. But the trust document, that was a legal and financial cannon, aimed directly at the foundation of the life my father and Linda had built. A plan began to form, not in a rush of fury, but in a cold, methodical sequence of thoughts. A public accusation would be messy. They could deny it, paint me as a hysterical, greedy daughter. Linda was a master of spinning narratives. She'd twist my grief into an attack. No, I couldn't just confront them. I had to dismantle them, piece by piece. I had to take away their power, their credibility, and their comfort, before they even knew they were under attack. Carol saw the shift in my expression. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice low. I looked at her, the first true ally I'd had in a decade. "I'm thinking that for 10 years, they've controlled the story," I said, my own voice sounding unfamiliar, steady and cold. "They got to decide who was the hero and who was the villain. That's over. I'm not just going to correct the narrative, I'm going to reclaim it, and I'm going to take back every single thing they stole from me and my mother. The meeting with Mr. Finch was a revelation. He was an older gentleman with a kind face and eyes that had clearly seen every flavor of family avarice imaginable. He remembered my mother vividly, a remarkable woman, he said, looking over the copy of the trust agreement, so determined to provide for you, so worried about the future. He pulled up the original file on his computer, his brow furrowing as he read the notes. He confirmed everything. The trust was ironclad. My father, as trustee, was legally obligated to manage it for my sole benefit. He was required to provide an annual accounting, something he had never done. Using the funds for household expenses, or worse for Kayla's benefit, wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. It was a breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially embezzlement. He likely assumed you'd never find out, Mr. Finch explained, his tone gentle but firm. It's a common and ugly story. A new spouse comes in, the child from the first marriage is sidelined, and assets are commingled. They rely on the child's ignorance or fear. He outlined the options. We could demand a full accounting of the trust immediately. We could file a civil suit to recover the principal, plus a decade of investment returns it should have generated. We could even report it to the district attorney, as the misuse of trust funds can cross into criminal territory. For a moment, the thought of my father facing criminal charges made my stomach clench. The last vestige of the little girl who loved her daddy cried out in protest. But then I remembered his face, nodding along as Linda called me a disappointment. I remembered the 10 years of coldness, of being treated like a stain on their perfect new life. The feeling passed. I told Mr. Finch I wanted to start with a formal legal inquiry. No accusations yet, just a polite but unyielding letter, sent via certified mail to my father's office, not the house. I didn't want Linda to intercept it and prepare a defense. I wanted my father to open it, alone, and feel that first jolt of pure, unadulterated panic. I wanted him to know that a clock had started ticking, but not who was holding the watch. This was the first move. The silent takeover had begun. I left Mr. Finch's office, feeling lighter than I had in years. I had a plan, I had an ally, and I had the truth, not just as a shield, but as a sharply honed spear. The coming days would be a test of my resolve. I knew the blowback would be immense, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Let them panic. Let the chaos begin. Their comfortable, curated world was a house of cards, and I was about to introduce a hurricane. The letter from Mr. Finch was sent on a Monday. I had tracked the certified mail receipt online, so I knew the exact moment it was signed for at my father's accounting firm, 9:17 a.m. on Wednesday. I spent the rest of the day in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the explosion. It came at 6:42 p.m. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Dad. I let it go to voicemail. I needed to control the terms of engagement. A minute later, a text message appeared. Jennifer, call me immediately. We need to talk about this ridiculous letter from some lawyer. Ridiculous. Not shocking, not confusing. Ridiculous. The classic language of dismissal. He was already trying to frame it as an absurdity, a nuisance. I didn't reply. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was Linda. I ignored that call too. Then came the barrage. A voicemail from my father, his voice tight with a forced calm that barely concealed his panic. Jen, I don't know what this is about. Some trust from your mother. It's a misunderstanding. That money was used for the family, for your own upbringing after she was gone. You can't be serious. Call me. Then a voicemail from Linda, all syrupy concern. Jennifer, honey, your father is very upset. This lawyer has clearly gotten something very wrong. You know we've always had your best interests at heart. Why would you go behind our backs like this? It's so hurtful. Please, let's just talk this out like a family. Like a family. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. We hadn't been a family in a decade. We were a cast of characters in a play she had written. Then came the texts from Kayla. Jen, what is going on? Mom is crying, and Dad is yelling. They said you're trying to sue them. Over what? Mom said it's about Grandma's money, and that you're being really selfish. I don't get it. I looked at her text, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something other than resentment for Kayla. I felt a sliver of pity. She was a pawn, a pampered, clueless pawn, but a pawn nonetheless. She had no idea her entire lifestyle, Her expensive education, her car, her privilege had been funded by money stolen from me. Her perfect family was a sham, and she was about to be caught in the crossfire. I didn't reply to her either. Silence, I was learning, was a powerful tool. Their panic was feeding on the vacuum I had created. They were used to me being reactive, apologetic, and eager to smooth things over. My refusal to engage was a new variable, and it was driving them insane. For the next 2 days, they tried everything. The calls became more frequent, the voicemails more desperate. My father's tone shifted from feigned confusion to outright anger. "This is a betrayal, Jennifer. After everything we've done for you, ungrateful. That's what this is. Your mother would be ashamed of you." Oh, the delicious, bitter irony of him invoking my mother's shame. Linda's messages became more manipulative, filled with tearful pleas and accusations. "You're tearing this family apart. Kayla is a wreck. Don't you care about anyone but yourself? This is exactly the kind of selfish behavior that broke your mother's heart." They were throwing their entire arsenal at me, using the same ammunition that had worked for 10 years. Guilt, shame, accusations of selfishness. But it wasn't working anymore. The words were just noise. They bounced off the new, hard shell I had grown. I had the journals. I had the truth. Their words were meaningless. I spent those 2 days with Carol, going through the journals again, but this time with a purpose. We weren't just reading for emotional context. We were building a case. We cross-referenced dates. A love letter from Linda mentioning a romantic weekend getaway, to a charming inn upstate lined up perfectly, with a journal entry from my mother describing how Mike had to go on a last-minute business trip, and how lonely the house felt. She'd written about feeling particularly sick that weekend, and how she'd had to call a neighbor just to help her open a jar of soup. We documented every instance, every lie, every stolen moment. It was a meticulous, heartbreaking archaeology of their deceit. And with every page, my resolve hardened. This wasn't just about money, it was about reclaiming my mother's memory from the liars who had tarnished it. The true panic set in on Friday. A second letter had arrived from Mr. Finch, this one more pointed. It formally requested a complete accounting of all transactions related to the trust from the date of its inception to the present, to be delivered within 30 business days, as required by law. It stated that failure to comply would result in a court order to compel the information. That evening, my father showed up at my apartment unannounced. I saw him through the peephole, his face pale and drawn. He knocked, then knocked again. Harder. "Jennifer, I know you're in there. Open the door. We are going to talk about this, right now." I didn't move. I just stood there, my back pressed against the door, my heart pounding not with fear, but with a strange cold power. He was no longer in control. The power dynamic had shifted. He was outside, on my doorstep, begging for an audience. I was inside, in my sanctuary, holding all the cards. After 5 minutes of knocking and calling my name, he finally gave up. I watched through the window as he walked back to his car, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked like a man who was finally realizing that the ghosts of his past were coming to collect. The silent takeover was complete. Now, it was time for the walls to start coming down. The first crack in their fortress appeared in the form of my Aunt Patty, my father's sister. She was the family gossip, a woman whose phone line was more effective than a newswire service. Linda had always managed her carefully, feeding her a steady diet of the official family narrative. Patty called me on Saturday morning, her voice a whirlwind of confusion and concern. "Jennifer, honey, your father called me last night, and he was a mess. He said you've hired a lawyer, and you're accusing him of stealing from you. He said you're trying to destroy the family over some money you think your mother left you." Linda was in the background, crying about how ungrateful you are. "It just sounds so awful. Is any of that true?" This was my moment, my chance to plant a seed of doubt. I didn't unload the whole story. That would be too much, too unbelievable, all at once. I had to be strategic. I took a deep breath and kept my voice calm and sad, not angry. "Aunt Patty," I said softly, "I'm not trying to destroy anyone. I just found out that my mom set up a college fund for me that I never knew about. Dad was supposed to be in charge of it, and I'm just trying to understand what happened to it." I paused, letting that sink in. There's a lot I've been learning lately. Things that don't make sense. "What things?" she asked. Her curiosity piqued. "Did you know," I said, my voice barely a whisper, that the weekend Dad and Linda went to that inn in the Berkshires for their first anniversary, the one they always talk about. That was the same weekend Mom had that really bad fall. The one she told everyone was just clumsiness. I found her journal, Patty. She wasn't just clumsy, she was sick, really sick, and she was all alone that weekend. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Had given her a single verifiable fact that clashed directly with the established timeline of their perfect love story. Patty had been the one my mother had called to take her to the emergency room after that clumsy fall. She knew that timeline better than anyone. 8, she said slowly, their anniversary. But Sarah, oh my God. The seed was planted. I didn't need to say anything about the affair. Patty was smart. She could connect the dots. Have to go, Aunt Patty, I said. But please, just think about it. I knew what would happen next. Patty would call my Uncle Robert. She would call my cousins. The Whisper Network, once Linda's greatest tool, was now working against her. The family exodus had begun. Within a week, the tone of the messages I was receiving started to change. Kayla's texts shifted from accusatory to confused. Jen, Aunt Patty called Mom. She was asking all these weird questions about when she and Dad started dating. Mom completely freaked out. What did you tell her? The real sign of their desperation, however, was the invitation. It arrived in a shimmering, offensively cheerful envelope. Linda and Mike requested the honor of my presence at a party to celebrate their 15th wedding anniversary. It was to be a grand affair at a rented event hall, a renewal of their vows, a public reaffirmation of their perfect family. It was so transparent, it was almost pathetic. They were trying to shore up their crumbling public image, to gather the family and present a united front against my scandalous accusations. They needed me there, smiling in the front row, to prove that everything was fine. It was a trap, a stage designed for them to publicly shame me back into submission. But they made a critical error. They thought I was still afraid of their stage. They didn't realize I was just looking for a platform of my own. I RSVP'd yes. In the meantime, their counter-manipulation went into overdrive. Linda began calling distant relatives, weeping about how I was being manipulated by a money-grubbing lawyer into destroying my father's reputation. My father left me a long, rambling voicemail that swung wildly between threats and pleas. He threatened to cut me out of his will, a hollow threat, since I now knew there was nothing left to inherit. Then he pleaded, his voice cracking, talking about how much he loved my mother and how this was tarnishing her memory. The hypocrisy was so profound, it left me breathless. He was the one who had tarnished her memory every single day for the past 15 years. He just couldn't stand that the mirror was finally being held up to his face. The battle lines were drawn. They had their stage, their rented hall, and their carefully crafted fiction. I had a leather-bound journal, a trust document, and a truth that was about to burn their whole world down. The night of the anniversary party felt like the final act of a long, terrible play. The event hall was decorated in an ostentatious palette of cream and gold, Linda's attempt at sophisticated elegance. A string quartet sawed away in a corner, their music a thin veneer over the tension that crackled in the air. As I walked in, conversations stuttered to a halt. Eyes followed me. I could see the family had fractured into camps. Aunt Patty and Uncle Robert gave me a small supportive nod from across the room. A few cousins offered tentative smiles. But many others, loyal to the established narrative, just stared with cold judgment. Linda, looking radiant in a champagne-colored gown, and my father, stiff and uncomfortable in his tuxedo, were working the room like politicians, their smiles wide and brittle. Linda saw me and immediately swept over, her daughter Kayla trailing in her wake like a confused lady-in-waiting. "Jennifer, darling," she exclaimed, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm so glad you came. It means the world to us that you're here to put all this unpleasantness behind us." She squeezed my arm, her nails digging in slightly. It was a warning. "Play along, or I will destroy you." I just smiled a serene, empty smile. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Linda," I said, my voice even. The evening was a master class in passive aggression. During the toasts, several of Linda's friends made pointed remarks about loyalty and the sanctity of family. It was all aimed at me. I just sat at my table, sipping my water, a small, unassuming clutch on my lap. Inside it was my mother's third journal. Finally the moment came. My father stood up to give the main speech, his voice trembling slightly. He talked about his blessed 15 years with Linda, the woman who saved him from the darkness after his tragic loss. He talked about family, about forgiveness, about moving on from past pain. It was a speech written by Linda, for Linda, and it was the final lie I was willing to endure. Then Linda took the microphone for their vow renewal. She looked directly at me as she spoke. "I promise to continue to protect this family," she said, her eyes glittering with malice. "To guard it against all hardship, and to always, always cherish the bonds of love and forgiveness that hold us together, no matter how they are tested." The room erupted in applause. This was my cue. As the applause died down, I stood up. A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on me. Linda's smile tightened into a rictus of fury. My father looked like he was about to be physically ill. "I'd just like to say a few words as well," I said, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the sudden silence. I walked to the front of the room, not to the microphone, but to the small space next to it, so everyone could see me. "I've been listening to all these beautiful words about family and forgiveness and memory," I began, my eyes scanning the crowd before landing on my father and Linda, "and it's made me think a lot about my mother, Sarah." A murmur went through the room. For 10 years I've lived with the story that my teenage rebellion broke my mother's heart and led to her death. I believed it, and I have lived with that guilt every single day. I paused, letting the weight of that confession settle, but a few weeks ago I received my mother's private journals, and they tell a very different story. I opened the clutch and pulled out the worn leather-bound book. The gasp from Linda was audible. They tell the story of a woman secretly and bravely fighting a painful degenerative illness, an illness she hid so that her daughter could have a normal, happy childhood. I looked directly at my father, and they tell the story of an affair. The room fell into a dead, shocked silence. Kayla's face was a mask of white horror. I'd like to read just 2 short entries. The first is from my mother, dated October 14th, 10 months before she died. I opened the journal, my hands perfectly steady. My voice didn't waver. The pain in my legs was so bad today, I couldn't get up the stairs. Mike had to go away for the weekend, a last-minute business trip. The house feels so big and empty. I feel so alone. I just pray I have the strength to see Jennifer through her teens. She is my whole world. I closed the journal and let the silence hang there for a beat. Then I pulled a single folded sheet of paper from inside it, a copy of one of Linda's letters. "And this," I said, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is a letter from Linda to my father, also dated October 14th. I looked right into Linda's eyes, watching the blood drain from her face. "My darling Mike," I read, "this weekend at the inn has been a dream. I ache for the day we don't have to hide. Just be patient. It will all be over soon." The collective intake of breath in the room was like the sound of the tide going out. The narrative was corrected, instantly, irrevocably. I wasn't finished. It seems my mother's memory isn't the only thing that's been misrepresented. I turned to my father. "The $75,000 she left in a trust for my education, the one you told me never existed. My lawyer, Mr. Finch, will be in touch about recovering it, with interest." I placed the journal and the letter copy on the cake table, a final public offering of the truth. Then I turned and walked out of that silent, ruined party. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The new reality had been established. Their reign was over. The aftermath was exactly what you'd expect. It was a social and familial implosion. Aunt Patty told me later that after I left, the room descended into chaos. Linda apparently tried to claim the journals were forgeries, that I was mentally unstable, but the damage was done. Reading the words in my mother's and her own handwriting side by side was too specific, too damning to be denied. The affair happening while my mother was sick and dying was a sin that even the most loyal family members couldn't forgive. Their 15th anniversary party became the day their marriage, and their reputation, effectively died. They were ostracized. Old friends stopped calling. Invitations to neighborhood barbecues and community events dried up. The perfect image they had spent a decade and a half cultivating was shattered in less than 5 minutes. Legally, my father had no choice but to comply. Faced with a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty, and the very real threat of criminal charges, he liquidated some of his own assets to pay back the trust. With the decade of calculated interest Mr. Finch fought for, the final amount was nearly $150,000. It wasn't a windfall, it was restitution. It was the physical manifestation of my mother's final act of love for me. My father tried to call me once after the money was transferred. I answered, curious to hear what he could possibly say. It was a weak, pathetic apology, full of excuses. He said he was grieving, that he was lost, that Linda had taken advantage of his vulnerability. He never once took full ownership of his choices, of his complicity in the affair, or the cruelty towards me. I listened, and then I said, the man my mother married would have never done what you did. I don't know who you are anymore. Goodbye, Mike, and I blocked his number. As for Kayla, her world fell apart. She was forced to confront the fact that her mother was a manipulative liar, and her idyllic childhood had been financed by stolen money. She reached out to me with a long rambling email, apologizing and saying she had no idea. Part of me believed her, but another part knew it didn't matter. She had been a willing and happy beneficiary of the lie for too long. I wrote back a single sentence. I hope you find a way to build a life based on your own truth. I don't know if she ever did. I heard through Aunt Patty that Linda and Mike are still together, living in that same house, but now as prisoners in a jail of their own making, surrounded by the ghosts of their lies. It wasn't the explosive divorce I might have once wished for, but in a way it's a more fitting punishment. They have to live with each other, every day, knowing exactly who they both are. And me? I used the money to do exactly what my mother would have wanted. I went back to school and got my master's degree in library science. And with the remaining funds, I established a small foundation in her name, the Sarah Albright Grant, which provides funding for research into Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease and offers support to families navigating a new diagnosis. It's my way of making sure her real story, her strength, her sacrifice, her love is the one that endures. I corrected the family narrative, but I also learned a valuable lesson. Some truths don't set you free in a joyful, triumphant way. They just change the locks on the cage you were in. They give you a different kind of freedom, a quiet, solitary peace that comes from knowing you survived, you stood your ground, and you honored the people who truly deserved it. It wasn't about revenge in the end, it was about restoration, restoring my mother's memory, restoring my own name, and finally, restoring my own life. It's funny how a story that feels so unique to you can echo in so many other people's lives. Maybe you've been the family scapegoat. Maybe you've had your reality denied by the people who were supposed to protect you. The details might be different, but that feeling of injustice is a universal language. Taking back your own story is the hardest and most important thing you can ever do. It's not about convincing the people who hurt you, it's about convincing yourself that you deserve the truth. Thank you for listening to my story today. If you have a similar experience of reclaiming your own narrative or dealing with a difficult family dynamic, I'd be honored if you shared it in the comments below. Reading your stories helps all of us feel a little less alone in these struggles. If my story resonated with you, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel for more content. Every bit of support helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them the most. Remember to take care of yourselves and to always be the author of your own life.